Thank you so much for joining us here at The Research Her, the show working to improve the health disparities for women of color, one topic at a time. I am Alicia. I'm here learning and growing with you as we research our way to well-being. Welcome back. And we black. Or not black. Whatever. You know, hey, how you doing? Today on the show, we have Dr. Lauren Jackson, who teaches in the Department of English and African American Studies at Northwestern University. She recently released her first book called White Negroes, When Cornrows Were in Vogue and Other Thoughts of Cultural Appropriation. And it was published back in November, and you can go ahead and get it on however you get your books. Amazon. I will have a link in the show notes. Dr. Jackson's work, such as research, criticism, essays, all of that, has appeared on platforms such as The Atlantic, Complex, Feminist Media Studies, different NPR podcasts, Teen Vogue, Vulture, and lots of places. She's doing her doggone thing, okay? She received her bachelor's with distinction in English from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in 2013. She continued on to earn a Ph.D. in English language and culture at University of Chicago, okay, in 2019. Her dissertation is titled Black Vitiligo, Attunement, Nausea, Aphasia, and Bodily Noise, 1970s to the present. With that, let's hop into this conversation with Dr. Jackson. Welcome to the show, Lauren. I'm so excited to have you here.
Thank you for having me. I'm really just excited to be on.
Yeah, so I like to start off the episode with a few icebreaker questions to just get us warmed up, and they're kind of fun. Whatever, we'll see how it goes. So, first question is, what is the last song that you listened to?
That's actually that should not be a tough question because it's music, but I listen to so many podcasts these days, even when I work out, that, what was the last song I listened to?
So what was the last podcast you listened to? There we go.
Okay. That's a lot easier. The last podcast I listened to was actually, it's called Here to Slay. I think it's a recent podcast, with Roxanne Gay and Tressie McMillan Cotton. And the episode I listened to had Ava DuVernay on there. It was through my phone. It was through my headphones. But yeah, that was the last thing I listened to.
Nice. Okay. Thank you for that. And what is a food that you wish were calorie free?
All of them. I don't know. Probably
everything. The whole grocery store.
It is really everything. But I don't know. Mac and cheese. I rarely make mac and cheese just because it's whole to do. But I would go ham on that.
Yes, each time. Yes. And the last icebreaker question: if you could break the law one time, what would you do?
That's hard. I'd like to lead a mass insurrection or something like that, or overthrow the government. But I think that would take more than one or two illegal actions to make happen.
Yeah, nice. So let's get to the official interview. Did you always know that when you grew up you would end up studying American literature?
Absolutely not even close. For a long time when I was a kid, I wanted to be a marine biologist. Since I was 5, I loved going to the aquarium all the time, almost every week. And looking back, I'm like, oh man, the aquarium, God, that was so expensive. And we would have to drive into the city, which is a whole to do too. I asked, okay, what is the type of person that is their life's work? They get to do that. They get to work with dolphins and other sea mammals, and it was marine biologist. So up until probably high school, I thought I was going to be a marine biologist. I wanted to be a marine biologist until I learned that marine biologists don't really make a whole lot of money. A lot of their funding, or a lot of the money and resources that they have to support themselves is really dependent on grant funding, government funding, research funding, which ultimately becomes very ironic in that I did go on to study English literature at the graduate level. But briefly, after the marine biologist thing, I thought I was going to be a surgeon, thought I was going to be a lawyer, thought I was going to be a graphic designer. I I really wanted to work for Pixar. I actually went into college as part of the College of, I think, Visual Arts at UAUC, where I was for a year before I switched to English. And then it was within, a year or two, I think, of studying English that I was really enthralled by, what the graduate students were doing, and thought that this is where I could kind of be for the rest of my intellectual career, so to speak.
So were there any people in specific that really influenced you?
Yeah, I think it was when I started to, when I was able to start taking more specialized classes, more upper division classes. So the department where I went to college, the English department, swings more towards the British lit type of thing. So a lot of American classes I had to take as electives and I had to seek out. So taking classes on slavery, on antebellum American cultures, on post-colonial literature, that type of subject matter, I think really opened the field and the discipline to me. I had a TA that I really loved named Ashley, who was really great. I had a really amazing TA in that post-colonial literature class. I had great experiences with Justine Murrison, who was a professor there, as well as Christopher Freeberg, who was a professor there, both of which took me under their wing a little bit as far as mentoring me once, I made it clear that I would like to continue doing this. And it seemed like I had an aptitude to do this. Really getting into those types of questions that you can ask of literature that really excited me and made me want to continue doing this at a kind of more focused level.
Mm-hmm. So a PhD is a big step. I don't know how it is in English, but you kind of have to know what you are thinking about getting into or what you really want to do after you graduate from college. So what was it that truly inspired you to say, I really enjoyed my undergrad experience, but I want to get this PhD?
I think it really was just taking those upper division classes. And I don't think I didn't really have any idea the full scope of commitment going in. And I'm actually glad about that. I had a very simple, could even say naive aspiration, which was I like sitting in this classroom. I like sitting and discussing and asking questions about and writing papers about literature and kind of sussing out all that can be found and all that we can discuss and talking about it with other people. I would like to keep doing this. Turns out there's a means of continuing to do that is called the academy, that is called going to graduate school and getting a PhD, and ideally, but not so realistically, getting a tenure track job. For me, it was really a matter of I like doing this thing. I'm good at doing this thing. There is a track to do this professionally, and this is how you do it. And so speaking with professors, of course, learning how to focus some of my interests, but, not too finely. I think in the humanities, it might be a little bit different than the sciences in that I think having an openness and having an aptitude is maybe more important than having a defined project. My interests between my research statement and writing sample going into graduate school are so far away from what I actually ended up proposing for my dissertation proposal, which itself is even further from what I ended up writing for the dissertation itself. Really, it is about kind of having that curiosity and being able to ask questions and an interest for thinking of something deeply, whatever that something actually ends up being once you hopefully get into a program.
I love your honesty. I love how essentially what you said was I didn't really know what I was getting into or specifically what I wanted to do when I joined the PhD program, but it ended up working out. I think a lot of times that it's pretty intimidating thinking about getting into a PhD program because everyone else seems to have it all figured out. And I think you knew that your passion was in American literature and English, and you just went for it and you found people that you can speak to in regards to going more academic route. I think you will be starting, like a tenure track job. You have a position that
So I'm at University of Chicago right now. So that's where I'm completing the English program there. And then next year, I will be a college fellow at Northwestern University in the Department of English, as well as the Department of African American Studies. And then the following year is when I begin as an assistant professor in both of those departments in a tenure track position. Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
It's all like
of academia. As far as I'm concerned, it's a dream position for sure.
It definitely is a dream position. Congratulations. That is an amazing university, and to have an opportunity to get a position there, like, you're dope. That's really dope.
Thank you.
So how did you end up choosing your advisor?
It happened pretty organically. I think each graduate student approaches it differently. You know, some people come in with a very set idea of who they want to work with. And I think it's always important, obviously, to have faculty available that align with your interests, that you could see yourself working with, at least in theory. But I also think it's really important to be flexible and open, because this is a working relationship. This is a collaborative relationship. Faculty are people and you're a person, and, you know, not everyone is always going to have the best kind of intellectual working relationship, whether it's just because people have different vibes or someone's research is actually not what you thought it was from the first monograph they published 20 years ago that you initially read, and maybe they're on to something completely different now, right? So, I mean, I personally came in very naive, but like also very open, and I kind of just took classes in things that I thought were of interest to me. So, you know, I took my first quarter there, I took a seminar with Adrienne Brown on architecture and literature. I didn't know anything about architecture and literature. I didn't know anything about architecture. I didn't know about Le Corbusier. I didn't know about the veranda and things like that. But those are things we were looking at, just the way in which you could read architecture as a racial structure, which is a very generalized account of what some of Adrienne's work does, was very interesting to me and really intriguing to me. I took a seminar with Lauren Berlant, who I came to work with for my dissertation. I took a lot of seminars and just things that were interesting to me, in addition to, you know, satisfying the relatively loose course requirements that my program had. Ideally, it kind of happens the way that it happened for me, which is you take classes with a variety of professors who work within a somewhat narrow range of your interests. You continue to either take classes with them or work with them on your exams list or individual studies of some sort. You get to see, you know, how they respond to your work, how you respond to their work, see if you click, and sort of start to see if you can imagine working together on the 2, 3, 4, etc. year project that a dissertation ultimately is, from exam stage to defense stage.
Your 5-year marriage, yeah. Your 4 to 5 year marriage, yeah, pretty much is what it is.
I don't know if I would call it a marriage, but it's a commitment for sure.
Yeah, that's kind of how they introduce it to us when we first got into the program. It's like, you are married to this group for 5 years. Imagine coming straight out of undergrad and that's what you hear. I'm like, marriage, and so it was a lot of anxiety being provoked.
Yeah, maybe they might need to tweak that language a little bit.
It's funny because it's I think it's very common language in like the more physical sciences.
I mean, I do think the sciences you do have a somewhat probably different relationship to your advisor and your committee and your peers maybe than we do in the humanities. I'm sure I'm making a huge blanket statement, but I just, from what I know from people who do work in labs and things like that, it is kind of like you are coming on to someone else's rodeo, right? And you're kind of there. It's like you can't just kind of move. You can't just be like, well, I don't know, this isn't really for me. I'm going to move over to, you know, Professor whoever's experiment, when Professor whoever already has his roster of people he's working with. So it is a little bit more set in stone. Whereas in the humanities, it can be a little bit more loosey-goosey. People can kind of float in, float out. In fact, someone on my committee is actually from the Department of Musicology, and he's someone I have never taken a class with, But once I realized I wanted to talk a little bit about music in my dissertation, my committee, as it was then, so Lauren and Adrian kind of encouraged me to reach out to someone who's actually going to be able to be an expert in that area and be able to, look at my analysis and tell me whether it's bullshit or not. But I think that is a little bit different than kind of coming onto a set team or something like that.
So when you were picking your research focus, or at least that initial research focus, because I know it obviously has grown and taken on a whole new form since the beginning, how did that work? How did you go about picking that? Was it based on the classes that you were taking, or were you kind of looking at more things that were going on in the world and saying, you know what, I would love to know more about why this is a thing?
I think it's a combination. I mean, when I was going through and taking courses, you would take a course, you would write, if it was a seminar, you would write what's called a seminar paper, which is 20 to 25 plus page research paper, essentially on whatever you want, but something ideally provoked by questions and texts from the class. So, one seminar paper I took for a class with Bill Brown, who's notable for his work with objects and thing theory. And I wrote a paper about Pauline Hopkins' Of One Blood and, the idea of blood as a liquid, as a substance with weight and what is attached to it and what we think about it and what is signified by it in a kind of turn of the century American racial landscape. So that's like an example of what, a seminar paper would be, right? And so by the end of 2 years of coursework, if you come in without a master's, which I did not have, you kind of accumulated at least 4 or 5 of these weighty, extended research papers. Because it's you and because you write about things that you're interested in, even as they are kind of torqued by the theme of whatever course it's for, patterns start to emerge, questions repeat themselves, texts repeat themselves, periods repeat themselves, and you kind of start to have a sense of, okay, these are the things that I keep coming back to and that I'm interested in. So the next stage of the program, you're taking your orals exams, which for my program means 2 lists of about, I think, like 50 to 60 texts or 50 to 60 items, a mixture of criticism and theory and poetry and novels and essays and, whatever constitutes literature these days, which is, everything from video games to film and all that jazz. You read all these lists and these 2 lists are guided by your research interests. So my 2 lists, I had a list on African-American literature and the vernacular, which included a lot of canonical texts on a lot of people thinking about, okay, what actually constitutes African-American speech? What constitutes African-American speech in literature, outside of literature, in sociology and linguistics, etc. I had another list that I did that was on, it was a little bit more eclectic, but on kind of the transmission of vernacular and speech in general. And so again, that had some kind of classic literary theory, theoretical texts, some Derrida, some Saussure, but it also had some kind of weirder texts or unconventional texts like a novel called The Wind and Gone. And so out of these lists, I started to accumulate my interest in speech and vernacular and the way in which the vernacular itself communicates certain affects, the way in which Black literature has articulated the feeling of being Black across history, but particularly in the decades following the kind of fractious moment of the post-civil rights movement. And so continuing to ask these questions about speech, about sound, about agitation, continuing to ask those questions. And out of that came my dissertation, which is entitled Black Vertigo, Attunement, Aphasia, Nausea, and Bodily Noise, 1970 to the present, which in the broadest description is a study of the aesthetics of disorientation in what I call contemporary, but is really at this point now late 20th and early 21st century African-American literature, music, and eventually art, other forms of literature, film. I want to run the whole gamut as far as cultural production, but the dissertation for right now is very much on Black literature.
Yeah, and what I really love about the work that you do is that you find a way of taking the academic world and what you learn there and putting it out there for pop. I want to say pop culture, but more so for the masses. I'll say for the masses. So you speak about African American language, And one of the pieces that I saw that you had done was about, I think it was titled, Who Owns the Black Sin? I'm not sure how much this correlates to the work you actually do for your thesis or your dissertation. So who owns the Black sin?
Yeah, so when I was kind of early in writing my dissertation proposal years ago, I initially framed the project as I want to study how Black becomes white. I want to study the appropriation of Black vernacular by white people. I want to examine that moment when the Black thing becomes the white thing. And one of the questions my advisor asked me was, why are you assuming this thing over here is the same thing as that thing over there? I wasn't asking a question. I was saying point blank, appropriation means this object over here is taken by these people over here because they want it or because they like it and because that's always the way it's been, and that it's now over here and that it's the same thing and that it hasn't changed. And I wasn't asking questions. And I think just the simple directive to stop and think, well, is that thing there the same thing as that thing over there? It was actually a really profound pause for me to take.
I just want to make sure I want to make sure I'm keeping up. So I guess the question that I have is, what you're talking about is essentially cultural appropriation and asking the question of whether something that was done in Black culture and now all of a sudden is done in white culture. Your advisor asks you, are they truly the same thing? And you're trying to figure out whether there is truly a link between the two or whether they are two separate things. Is that what you're kind of saying?
So I think in like conversations of quote unquote cultural appropriation, I just call it appropriation because I'm not really sure what the marker of cultural is doing in a lot of cases. And I think sometimes it feels a little bit redundant, actually.
Got it.
But I think there's this gap in the conversations that we tend to have about it where we say Black people started twerking, now white people are twerking. And so we move from observation to like castigation without any curiosity about what really happens in the middle. And the thing about Miley Cyrus twerking is that is that twerking? I don't know. It's a desire to twerk. It's a want to twerk. It's a imitation. It's a mimicry. But is what she's doing the same gesture as the twerking that we're kind of talking about and pointing to when we're thinking about something being appropriated? I think having room for the kind of curiosity about the way culture travels is really important, especially in the age of the internet, because assuming that there's just this one-to-one relationship between a Black person does something, a white person sees it, wants it, is cognizant enough of their own mind and their own desires to try to thieve this thing and put it on their own body, I think makes a lot of assumptions that actually don't make sense for the way that culture travels and the way that racial aesthetics travel and have traveled since the minstrel stages, since Eric Lott's Love and Theft, truly. And so one of the texts that really profoundly shaped the way that I think about culture is Homi Bhabha's Location of Culture, which I read during my orals exams. And just the nature of ambivalence. It was another one of those pause moments where so many gestures are so much more ambivalent than we give them credit for. There's all these people reading so much into this little snippet of a trailer. And like, I am all for close reading. Absolutely. I will close read something down to a frog's hair, right? Like that's how close I'm going to get. That's how fine it's going to get for me. But I saw a lot of projection that I was just curious, knowing that this is a excerpt from a much larger cultural object. I was actually curious to see, okay, how actually does this character behave and move and speak in the context of a larger movie? And so thinking about what Awkwafina, how she speaks is very much an effect. It's an affectation. You know, there's a clear, it does seem to present a kind of want of a certain type of cultural cliche. There is a way in which her character kind of slides into the trope that would, in an otherwise film with white people on American soil, primarily would probably be filled by, you know, the sassy Black best friend. And I thought it was really interesting the way that they, you know, this movie kind of needed to fulfill that in some role. And so that was fulfilled by a kind of rapper turn actress, comedic actress who does kind of do the head bob and the, you know, finger wag and whatnot. But at the same time, it's like, is that Blackness? Is that Black culture right there? You know, I look at that and I don't see Black. I see desire. I see imitation. But to call that something essentially, to put that on equal footing with Blackness, I thought was the kind of slippage that, I don't know, I like precise language. So I just thought it was just like really maddening. Which is why I kind of wanted to write that piece, and thinking about the ways that Black vernacular has been so desired and imitated for centuries that essentially Hollywood doesn't need the Black best friend anymore. They don't have to have an actual Black person to kind of fulfill the trope of a Black best friend or something like that. And I just wanted to kind of think about the ways in which culture kind of ambivalently travels, and the fact that somebody like Aquafina, it almost doesn't even matter where she actually learned to speak like that or where she picked that up. It just kind of matters that she kind of signals some sort of Blackened vernacular. But that is not to say that what she's doing is Blackness or what she's performing is Blackness. And that, you know, in a global world, in a world with the internet, in a world where you do have white teenagers saying shade and bae and like all these things, it's like, what is the next level of that? What about most white people do not have any Black friends? The vast majority of white people theoretically are learning their quote unquote Black vernacular from either other white people, non-Black people, or television and film and movies with Black characters written by white writers. Mm-hmm. So it's like, is that Blackness? Mm-hmm. Or is this just fake Black sense learning from other fake Black sense? Mm-hmm. So really long way to work my way into
but then this gets a little complex too, because we talked about like Blackness and that transition into it becoming more I guess it will be copied by other cultures. And in particular, when you said you were looking at your research started off, you know, looking at how it goes from being in something that's done in the Black community to something else being done by others. In this case, it's done in not so much like a white space, but in an Asian space, you know? So that complicates things too, is it's not just...
I think this is why, you know, I like to make the distinction between like white, non-Black, and Black. So I think a lot of times people of color use white as like a shorthand for kind of like the opposite of, you know, there's people of color and then there's white. And some people use people of color when they actually mean Black, and some people mean white when they actually mean non-Black, right? And so it can get a little, you know, and this is why I say, like, again, I think precision is key, because this was a film about, it's really a film about Asian Americanness, but the fact that, you know, it still needed to have a narrative that would kind of conform and could mold to certain romantic comedy tropes that we're very used to seeing with white people, with, you know, white people and tokens, right? So it almost doesn't matter. You know, you don't need a Black person to have Blackness in the room or kind of desire for Blackness in the room. You don't need to, it doesn't have to be white people for there to play up on kind of white derived Asian stereotypes. And so that's why I think it's kind of important to think about aesthetics and not so much about bodies, because I think we always talk about bodies, and I think sometimes that makes us miss what's actually going on.
Yeah. And then speaking on, you don't really need Black people in a space in order for there to be Blackness present. I came across a term when looking at your work called Blackfishing. So can you speak a little bit about what Blackfishing is?
Yeah, so sure. I actually have like kind of mixed feelings about the term. It's a term that I think describes something that has been going on for longer than the term has sort of been in existence. And I think there's ways in which sometimes creating new terms actually elides the connections and the historical connections between certain types of aesthetics and racial performances. But that's a whole other thing. But anyway, blackfishing is a term developed, or I think like at least co-developed by a writer by the name of Wanda Thompson. And she brought it to prominence, and it was actually originally called nigger fishing, but in the kind of straightened up vernacular, I guess, of the kind of media circulation.
That wasn't going to be as well accepted. It had to be.
Yeah. If ABC News is going to cover it, they're not going to call it that, right?
Yeah.
So she made a thread on Twitter, basically a call to the community as far as, what are we going to do with all these white girls on Twitter who are very popular, who are maybe kind of like shilling products, basically making money off their look, and are essentially masquerading as Black girls, or at the very least enjoying the kind of privilege of not being read as white, right? But quote unquote racially ambiguous or something like that. And so blackfishing, which is obviously derived from catfishing, is just the idea of racial confusion or leaning into certain visual signifiers of Blackness to lead users to believe that you're not just a regular milk-fed, corn-fed white girl, and that you're something else or you're exotic, and sort of playing up on that racial fetishism. Mm-hmm. So, I wrote a piece on that, which similarly to the Blacksnip piece, I was also kind of interested in thinking about the ambivalence kind of at the heart of so-called blackfishing, which is that, again, I think it assumes that people really know themselves to think that these white girls are, as a collective, studying the kind of signifiers of Blackness and going, okay. I know that, racial fetishism has this kind of cultural cachet and cultural capital. So I need to tan really dark. I need to put a wave in my hair. I need to get hoop earrings and Jordans and complete this look and sit in this stance and do this and catch the sun this way, so that people will think I'm biracial or something like that. If there's probably somewhere out there, definitely people with that level of calculated thought about it. I think the whole phenomenon of blackfishing says more about sort of the internet in general and social media in general, and the way in which cultural trends and fashion trends and certain aesthetics travel in the age of the internet, where in American culture that does prize certain things from Black culture and from Black fashion, the way in which major celebrities like the Kardashians have kind of popularized these visual staples that are so well known to girls on the block, such that you can be a girl from Sweden, as I think Emma Hallberg, one of the Blackfishers kind of named in the thread, is, and you can just put all these things on your body and not really even think about where they came from or what kind of racial story that you're telling with your photos. And so the point is that, appropriation does not necessarily have intention. There aren't necessarily desires that are conscious enough for someone to know them. It happens really very naturally, which is not to say that there isn't a conversation to be had about power and who is allowed to kind of make money off of their creativity, whose intellectual property is protected, which are all definitely conversations that you can have around appropriation. But I don't think they can be had by assuming that all appropriation is a conscious theft. Because if you just tell people not to appropriate, that's not going to get anything. That's not going to do anything done. Like that's not how appropriation works. Appropriation isn't, I walked by the hood this day and saw someone wearing that thing and, I want that thing now. It kind of suffuses the way our culture works and the way culture mutates and changes.
Mm-hmm. So essentially, the origin of this, though, you don't feel is necessarily a social media thing. You spoke about the fact that there is a historical piece to it. This has been going on since before social media, right? Where the Black culture or things that have been normally seen in Black culture is then being taken on as American culture or, the culture of the country. So then now you have what we think is culture or appropriation, not culture appropriation, just appropriation. But it's really, it happened way before there was this idea of catfishing.
Racial performance, racial masquerade is, as old as America itself. I think it's fair to say that there's something particular that happens in digital culture and in the digital space and on Instagram and on Twitter, and the way in which technology and social media can corroborate certain types of racial performances in a way that is much lower stakes than racial performances of old. You don't have to blacken up, literally painting yourself to become a minstrel these days. You don't have to do a song and dance on stage to be a minstrel anymore. Digital culture and the kind of subtleties that we have now of certain racial performances enables a whole generation of people to look, or at least kind of wade in the waters of ambivalence of non-Blackness, so to speak, which suggests, a proximity to Blackness, but it's still not Black, right? And not with all the kind of attendant baggage that comes with being Black, but rather this kind of safe zone of exoticism and avant-garde, to not be white, because white is passé, it's boring, right? But it's edgy to not be white. You get to be white and not white at the same time.
So do you think that there is anything that we can do in the digital space to make it a little bit more, I don't know if I should say safer, or to call these things out? Or is it just something that will continue on? It's really pointless to try to create a safer space for Black women, or to call out people who are essentially Blackfishing.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, this isn't...
You sound so drained.
No, I mean, this is not like my ministry per se, right? I think there's also... I think you have two different questions in there. So, there's, on one hand, how do we make online space for Black women is like a huge question, and a really crucial question, especially at this point in time, and one that the platforms themselves are pretty committed to ignoring. I don't know if it'd be easy, but there are people who know and have plans of, what Twitter could do, for example, to get rid of white supremacists, to keep trolls away, to make it easier for accounts to filter out and block and report the kinds of people that will come and give them, all kinds of threats against their person and dox them and do all sorts of dangerous things with the slightest bit of public information, right? Same thing with, Instagram, with Facebook, privacy and all of that. These are things that are kind of at the height of technology discussions and reporting and social media today, right? And I think it's very clear that the people who run these platforms don't have an interest in protecting Black women, which is why Black women and other women of color and white women and other vulnerable populations, are so unsafe online today. The other question, I don't think it's my job. I don't think it's any Black person's job to come on and, have to follow up on every racial masquerade that goes on Instagram, because we can spend all day doing it and
Get tired. Just
never
tired.
Right? I think it's a much harder topic. And I think that comes with a just culture-wide reevaluation of where we place our values and where we place credit and money and citation and all that, which is, again, a much larger task, would require essentially upending everything we think we know about culture and where it comes from. I don't know if that's hopeful or bleak.
Okay. So with everything you've learned in your research, do you find that you interact with people different, or that you see the world, obviously you see the world from a different lens, but how does it impact you on a day-to-day, the things that you've learned?
I think I just think about language really, really closely. Yeah, I'm a literary critic. So, when people tell me things, or when I read headlines or stories, I'm never just trying to take the information that it wants to give me. I'm trying to look at also the kind of information that's not being said, but that is still being omitted from the way something is worded, the way something is structured, whether it's in passive voice or active voice. For example, when a police officer kills a Black person, often we're going to see that headline. It's going to be in passive voice, as if the person who was murdered themselves or something like that. It's like there's just an absence of an antagonist there. or if they're going to be, you know, what photo are they going to use of the person who, are they going to use a mugshot for the person who, you know, past mugshot for the person who was killed, and going to use a family photo of the police officer who shot them. Things like this, which I don't think you have to be a literary critic to realize and pay attention to. But for me, I just think those are important things to keep up with. I can get really nerdy about it, but that's really fun to me. Like I said, I love close reading. I will close read anything.
Nice. And I'm like complete on the other side of the world. Like, nope. give me bullet points and I'm gonna skim it. I'm still gonna skim it. So that's cool. So I love hearing your perspective. So your book, White Negroes, When Cornrows Were in Vogue, and Other Thoughts on Cultural Appropriation. So can you talk to us a little bit about what to expect from that?
Sure. The book title, as you said, is White Negroes, and it's really taking a millennium approach to looking at appropriation and cultural appropriation. And I think a lot of discussions when we think about appropriation and kind of like the long view, you know, we think about people like Elvis, we think about blackface minstrelsy in the 19th century. But I really wanted to I'm a millennial, right? So I grew up 90s, early 00s, and now. And I really wanted to look at the way this kind of new state of the world, this millennium state of the world, has created new avenues, but, you know, also reinvigorated old ones for the desire of Black aesthetics on non-Black and white bodies. And so you really get a little bit of everything. The first chapter is on pop culture, and I'm looking at Christina Aguilera in the dirty era, but also thinking about other pop cultures in general, and that sort of old kind of recycled and expected trope of the pop girl gone wild. I look at food culture and Paula Deen. There's, you know, a little bit of Rachel Dolezal in there. There's a little bit of Whitney Biennial in there. There's memes in there, you know, YouTubers, the Women's March. You know, I really tried to take a broad view as far as themes and topics from chapter to chapter, but then in each chapter, really ask questions and think deeply about the cultural subjects and the pop cultural subjects, and incorporate the scholarship, but not too much, and hopefully present it in an artful way. I hope people like it. It's my first book, obviously, and I really loved writing it. I really loved working with the objects and the people and the images that I look at. I don't think it's a book that should make anybody feel bad, so to say. I think it's kind of fun to recall these moments, and time moves by so fast, and the internet makes things accelerate so much that I think even looking at something that happened in 2005 feels ancient, but it's also fun to look back. You know, I'm looking at things as early as, you know, the late 90s and as late as basically 2019, actually, when I made some edits to the book a couple months ago. So it's a very, very contemporary book. I think it's a fun book. I think it's for broad audience, white people, Black people, non-Black people. I think will enjoy it, hopefully. And yeah,
I'm excited. And congratulations. Yes, and congratulations. A book is a whole, and you are getting this done right while you're getting ready to defend your dissertation, which is crazy. Like, the overlap is just crazy to me. I know we have to learn how to multitask, but girl, like, why would you do that to yourself?
I don't know. I wanted to write a book so bad, and I just could not wait until I had my PhD to do it. And so, you know, I would definitely not recommend it, but I don't know. I'm pathologically attached to being busy and multitasking, working on more than one project at a time. So
I have one last question for you. We live in this digital age, and I wonder, like, do you have any advice for someone who's thinking about higher education in a space where you literally, you can go online and you see so many options for careers, and I don't know, we are all so connected. So do you have any advice for anyone who is thinking about higher education?
I would say read everything you can as far as like how you get into grad school, different types of programs, reading program websites, reading the difference between if you're abroad, an MPhil versus a PhD versus a literature program versus an English program versus an American Studies program versus, whatever, your research scope is, right? Emailing people, emailing professors, talking to people, reaching out. I mean, if you reach out to somebody respectfully, there's no reason to be super anxious about that. That's part of a professor's job, is to speak with prospective students and to answer questions. And most grad students I know would be happy, and I'm always happy to, hop on the phone with somebody and kind of give them the real deal. Looking up forums, there's like 1,000,001 forums for grad students and doctoral students, MDs and future vets and people who, don't spend too much time on those, because it's a hotbed for anxiety. Yeah. But I think just like reading everything you can, when I want to do something, I get like, so, for better or for worse, I get like very obsessive about it, and that it's all I can think about. And I'm just reading everything. When I wanted to write a book proposal, like all I could do is just read up online, try to find sample book proposals, reading, how this person did their book proposal, how that person did their book proposal. And just basically kind of trying to accumulate all I could get my hands on. And then also asking, people I knew who had written books or were about to write books, what they were doing. And I think just that information gathering is just so important, and is the best part of the digital age. But then pairing that also with, real life conversations obviously is so crucial. Speaking with people who know you, who ideally know your work, who have done the thing as every faculty member has, and just getting a good, well-rounded sense of, and also a realistic sense, not so much focusing on the degree or the job, but like the area that you want to work in, that interests you and that gives you life and all of that. Because, there are so many different routes to so many jobs. Not everyone kind of gets there in the same way. Being flexible to that, I think, is really important, and not thinking that just because one avenue is closed off that, the dream is dead. That's a lot.
Yeah, I loved it. Thank you so much for sharing space with me, sharing digital space with me, and coming on the show. I appreciate you so much. You left us with so much information, and I wish you the best.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on. This was really great. It's really cool. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for listening to this wonderful episode with Dr. Jackson. If you want to connect with her website will be linked in the show notes. It is laurjackson.com. It's LAUR Jackson.com. And you can also get her book off of Amazon, which I will put a link in the show notes. If you want to connect with me, I am at theresearchher.com. To research her on all social media. So connect with me. And until next time, I'll holla.